A mysterious distress signal traveled across the cold emptiness of space, carrying with it the voice of a civilization that had nearly destroyed itself. This alien race had once been strong, advanced, and proud, but now it stood on the edge of collapse. Their great cities were no longer filled with laughter or the sounds of progress. Instead, they were filled with silence, hunger, and fear. Disease spread through their people faster than they could control. Food was scarce, and famine clawed at every family, leaving children crying and parents helpless. And as if sickness and hunger were not enough, internal war broke out among their factions. Brothers fought brothers, leaders betrayed their own people, and trust vanished from their world. It was as though their entire civilization was tearing itself apart piece by piece. The aliens had once turned to their neighbors in the galaxy for help, but every time they reached out, doors closed on them. Some civilizations feared catching their diseases. Others thought offering food or medicine would only drag them into a conflict not their own. Many saw the dying race as weak, unworthy of saving, and believed it was better to let them collapse than waste resources on them. So no ally came, and one by one the galaxies that had once been full of noise grew cold and silent around them. Their cries went unanswered, their desperation ignored. With nowhere else to turn, their leaders gathered in what was left of their ruling council. It was a bleak meeting. Faces once proud and determined were now pale, sick, and lined with worry. The halls that had once echoed with the sounds of power and authority were now heavy with despair. Some argued that there was no hope, that no one would ever come to save them, that they should accept the end with dignity. Others argued with fire in their eyes, insisting that they could not give up, not when even a spark of survival remained. If their children were to have a future, someone had to fight for it. In the end, they made a choice. They would send one final message, a desperate cry into the void of space. It would be simple, honest, and full of the truth of their suffering. They would admit their weakness and beg for mercy. The message carried no pride, no demand, only the raw plea of a people on their knees. And so, with trembling hands, their last technicians crafted the signal, a message wrapped in hope and despair alike. When the time came to send it, the words they chose were stripped down to the barest need. We need aid, medicine, and peacekeepers. But then came the most difficult question: who to send the message to? Most of the galaxy had already abandoned them. Many civilizations had cut ties long ago, either out of fear or cold calculation. Only one name remained on their list, one species they had never dared to contact before because of its reputation: humanity. The aliens knew the stories whispered across the stars about humans. They were newcomers to the galactic stage, but their reputation had grown quickly and not always kindly. They were known as Deathworlders, a name that carried both fear and respect. Their home planet was violent and harsh, filled with predators, disasters, and endless dangers. To survive there, humans had been forced to grow strong, clever, and relentless. Other civilizations viewed them as unpredictable, dangerous, and even savage. And yet, for all their violence, humanity had also shown flashes of compassion that were impossible to ignore. When disasters struck other worlds, small human groups had volunteered aid. When strangers suffered, some humans gave what they could, even when they had little themselves. It was this contradiction, this mix of danger and kindness, that gave the aliens their last fragile hope. The council debated for hours, weighing their choices. Some were terrified. They argued that humans were too wild, too warlike, and that calling them would only bring more destruction. They feared that humanity would not come as saviors but as conquerors, seeing the weakened civilization as easy prey. Others, however, argued that they had no other choice. If they did nothing, their people would surely die. At least by calling to humanity, they had a chance, however slim. In the end, the decision was made. The message would be sent to Earth, the human homeworld. As the signal was prepared, the air in the council chamber was heavy with both hope and dread. They knew this was a gamble, perhaps the most dangerous gamble they had ever made. They were not just asking for help. They were placing the future of their entire species in the hands of strangers known for both mercy and war. The technicians activated the transmitters, and the signal shot into the darkness of space. It passed through nebulae glowing with starlight, crossed the silent stretches between galaxies, and moved like a whisper into the unknown. Each passing moment carried their plea further away from their dying world, and closer to the ears of whoever might hear it. And though they knew humanity might not answer, or might answer in a way that brought more pain than salvation. The aliens clung to one truth: doing nothing would guarantee their end. As the signal vanished into the cosmic silence, the council sat in uneasy quiet. They had taken their final chance, cast their desperate call into the heavens, and now they could do nothing but wait. In the broken streets below, sick mothers held their children close. Farmers stared at withered fields and prayed for rain. Soldiers, weary of endless civil wars, laid down their weapons in the hope that something better might come. And every single one of them looked up at the stars, wondering if somewhere out there, someone was listening. For the first time in years, their people felt a flicker of something they had nearly forgotten: hope. A fragile, trembling hope that across the void, another species might hear their suffering and choose compassion over cruelty. They hoped humanity would see them not as enemies, not as prey, but as fellow beings worth saving. But even as they prayed, a shadow of doubt lingered in every heart. They had heard the rumors about humans. They knew the risks, and yet they had made their choice. The last words of their message echoed through their minds: "We need aid, medicine, and peacekeepers." Those words carried their future. Those words carried their fate, and somewhere far away humanity would soon hear them. When the signal from the aliens finally reached Earth, it spread quickly among the world's governments, scientists, and military leaders. At first there was a strange silence, as if no one could believe what they were seeing. It was not every day that humanity received a direct plea for help from another intelligent species. The message was simple, almost painfully so: we need aid, medicine, and peacekeepers. The words carried sorrow and desperation, and they struck many who read them deep in their hearts. But at the same time they carried a sense of danger, for while some saw suffering creatures begging for help, others saw a trap waiting to spring. The first group to react was the scientific community. Across universities, research labs, and medical organizations, scientists and doctors began to draft plans. They argued that this was a chance to prove that humanity was not just strong but compassionate. They wanted to prepare ships filled with medical supplies, food, and teams of specialists who could treat disease, build clean water systems, and train alien doctors to care for their people. To them, this was not just an opportunity to save lives. It was a chance to make history by building trust between species. Many believed that if humanity answered with kindness, the galaxy would finally see Earth as more than a world of dangerous warriors. They imagined headlines like "Humanity saves a civilization" or "Earth responds with compassion." But while the scientists dreamed of healing, the generals dreamed of danger. In the highest levels of the military, fear spread like wildfire. The message, they argued, was too perfect, too simple, too easy. What if it was a trick? What if the dying aliens were not dying at all, but were luring humanity into a trap? Perhaps their message was bait, designed to make Earth send vulnerable medical ships that could be captured or destroyed. Or perhaps helping one civilization would drag humanity into a war with others. After all, history had shown, both on Earth and in space, that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The politicians were caught between these two worlds. They listened to the passionate speeches of scientists who spoke of hope and compassion, and then turned to the stern warnings of generals who spoke of risk and survival. The arguments lasted for days. In great halls of government, debates grew heated. One leader shouted, "If we send warships, we show the galaxy we are conquerors, not helpers." Another countered, "If we send doctors, we risk losing them all, and then Earth itself may be the next target." The air was thick with tension. Every voice believed it was protecting humanity's future, but no two sides could agree on what the future should be. Meanwhile, ordinary people on Earth also began to discuss the alien plea. Some citizens cried out that their governments must help, must show compassion. Others feared the unknown and whispered that it was foolish to risk human lives for strangers across the stars. Television programs, newspapers, and online networks buzzed with debates, each voice adding to the storm. Humanity, it seemed, stood at a crossroads, uncertain whether to choose mercy or fear. In the end, it was fear that won. The leaders, pressured by military warnings and the haunting thought of falling into a galactic trap, made their decision. They would not send doctors and food. They would not send peacekeepers. Instead, they would send power. Humanity's fleets, massive and armed, would be dispatched into alien space. Their mission was not to heal but to secure, to protect humanity first and maybe, if possible, to help the aliens afterward. It was a compromise made of iron and suspicion. And so the great engines of war roared to life. Across Earth, in orbiting stations and deep military docks, the call went out. Warships that had been resting in silence powered up their systems. Pilots and soldiers rushed to their posts. Great carriers were stocked not with medicine but with ammunition and steel. The sight of it was breathtaking. Hundreds of vessels rising from Earth's atmosphere, their polished hulls catching the sunlight, looking less like ships of aid and more like predators leaving their den. When the fleets finally set course toward the alien world, the skies above Earth burned with fire from their engines. Humanity's leaders told their people that they were answering the call for help, but inside many knew the truth. They were answering not with compassion, but with suspicion. The message had asked for peacekeepers, yet what they sent was an armada of warriors. Far away on the dying alien world, the people gathered in the ruins of their cities to watch the skies. They had waited so long hoping that someone, anyone, would answer their cry. And then one night, their hopes seemed fulfilled. Their sensors detected vast fleets approaching. At first, cheers broke out among them. They imagined ships filled with doctors and healers, aid workers with food, and engineers ready to restore clean water and electricity. They told their children that salvation had come, that soon their hunger would end and their illnesses would be cured. But when the first ships arrived, their joy froze in their throats. For instead of white hospital ships, they saw black steel warships. Instead of gentle cruisers filled with supplies, they saw towering carriers bristling with weapons. Instead of comfort, they saw intimidation. The sky above their world darkened not with storm clouds but with the shadows of human battleships. The alien people, weak and broken, stood in awe and terror as the armadas spread across their horizon like a mechanical storm. Some dropped to their knees, convinced their call for help had been misunderstood. Others whispered that this was no rescue at all, but the beginning of conquest. Parents clutched their children tightly, unsure whether humanity had come to heal them or to rule them. For the humans aboard those ships, the sight below was equally powerful. They saw cities crumbling, smoke rising, and bodies too weak to lift their heads. Many young soldiers felt pity, wondering why they had been sent with rifles instead of medicine. But their orders were clear: secure the skies, control the ground, and prepare for any threat. Compassion was not the mission. Survival was. The alien leaders, who had placed their trust in humanity, felt their hearts sink. Their gamble had been made and they had lost. They had asked for aid, medicine, and peacekeepers, but in their skies now hung fleets of war. To them, the sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a reminder of just how powerful humanity truly was, and how dangerous it could become when fear ruled over compassion. When the first human ships entered the alien skies, the people below felt an overwhelming rush of relief. For days they had gathered in broken streets and ruined fields, looking up at the heavens for the arrival of help. When the massive silhouettes of ships appeared above the horizon, their cries of joy filled the air. Children pointed with wonder, elders wept with gratitude, and leaders told their people, "At last salvation has come." They believed the long wait for doctors and supplies was finally over. The alien leaders acted quickly. They opened landing zones across their planet, clearing space in what remained of their cities and settlements. They prepared platforms for what they thought would be aid convoys, great vessels carrying food, medicine, and healing technology. They made speeches to reassure their people that humanity had come as friends, and they sent transmissions to the human commanders, offering full cooperation. To them, these preparations were acts of welcome, gestures of trust. But when the first human transports touched down, the sight was not what the aliens expected. Instead of crates of medicine being unloaded, rows of soldiers marched out in full armor. Instead of doctors in white uniforms, there were generals giving orders in harsh voices. Tanks rolled down ramps, drones spread across the skies, and scanners swept the alien streets as though searching for hidden threats. The humans did not arrive as healers, they arrived as warriors. At first, the aliens tried to understand. They told themselves that perhaps this was part of Earth's method, that maybe the soldiers were simply here to secure safe passage for the doctors, who would surely follow. They smiled nervously, still offering food and water to the human troops, still hoping that behind the soldiers would come the true aid they had asked for. Gratitude lingered in their eyes, but beneath it was the beginning of doubt. The humans, however, acted with caution born of suspicion. Their generals had drilled it into them: trust no one. Treat every faction as a potential threat. And so wherever humans landed, they quickly seized control of the area. Soldiers erected barricades, established command posts, and pushed the alien civilians back behind guarded lines. Entire neighborhoods were declared secured zones, and any alien who wandered too close was questioned, searched, and sometimes even detained. To the humans, this was safety. To the aliens, it looked like occupation. As the days passed, the difference between what the aliens hoped for and what the humans were doing grew impossible to ignore. The promised convoys of medicine never came. Instead, more ships filled with troops arrived. The humans patrolled streets with weapons ready, their eyes scanning every shadow. They dismantled alien communication towers and replaced them with their own. They demanded maps of cities and territories, not lists of medical needs. To the generals, this was strategy. To the aliens, it felt like chains tightening around their throats. Gratitude began to fade. In its place grew whispers of worry. Why do they need so many soldiers? Mothers asked as they watched armored vehicles rumble past their starving children. Where are the doctors? Elders muttered as they stood in food lines guarded by men with rifles. Leaders who had once promised salvation now struggled to calm their frightened citizens. Some began to wonder aloud if they had made a terrible mistake by calling humans for help. The humans themselves were not blind to the fear around them. Many young soldiers saw the thin, sickly faces of alien children and felt guilt twist in their hearts. They had imagined themselves as protectors, but the orders they followed made them look like conquerors. Some asked their commanders why no aid ships were coming, but the answer was always the same: first secure, then assist. Yet assistance never came. Securing never ended. The aliens, once filled with hope, now watched every new landing with dread. Every time a new fleet entered the skies, they no longer imagined food or medicine. They imagined more troops, more weapons, more control. Their trust drained away, replaced with suspicion. Why had the humans not sent doctors? Why had they sent armies instead? Slowly, the idea spread through their people. Humanity had not come to save them, but to take them. This suspicion deepened with every new order from the human generals. Curfews were established. Alien gatherings were broken apart. Patrols demanded identification, and those without it were dragged away. In villages where factions still fought each other, human forces intervened harshly, disarming everyone and punishing entire communities for the actions of a few. The aliens began to see not saviors but occupiers, cold, calculating, and merciless. Fear soon grew stronger than gratitude. Parents began warning their children not to go near the humans. Farmers no longer waved when soldiers marched past their fields. Markets grew silent when patrols entered, eyes dropping to the ground in fear. Murals once painted to celebrate humanity's arrival were scrubbed away, replaced with graffiti that whispered of betrayal. The gap between the two species widened with each passing day. The humans thought they were being careful, making sure no enemy could rise against them. But the aliens saw every action as proof of conquest. The humans thought they were creating order, but the aliens saw only chains. The humans thought they were protecting, but the aliens felt trapped. And so the hope that had once filled the skies with cheering voices now curdled into suspicion. Where there had been open arms, there were now clenched fists. Where there had been joy, there was now silence. What had begun with gratitude ended with fear, and the aliens who had once prayed for salvation now prayed only to survive the saviors they had called. The air between humans and aliens grew heavier with each passing day. Fear and suspicion had already replaced hope, and it was only a matter of time before something went wrong. The humans stood ready with their weapons, watching every shadow as if it hid an enemy. The aliens, tired of being treated like prisoners on their own land, began whispering in anger and resentment. Both sides distrusted the other, and in such a tense silence, the smallest spark was enough to start a fire. That spark came suddenly, in a remote village on the outskirts of the alien world. It was a small place, filled with weak and starving families where children played among broken houses and elders sat by dying fires. One morning, a group of human soldiers entered the village searching for hidden weapons or rebel fighters. To the soldiers, it was routine, just another patrol to secure the area. But to the villagers, it felt like another violation of their dignity. As the humans searched homes, a frightened alien farmer tried to stop them from entering his house. His wife was sick inside, and he did not want strangers trampling through. The soldiers, trained to treat resistance as danger, reacted harshly. One soldier shoved the farmer aside, another raised his weapon, and in the chaos a shot rang out. No one knew who pulled the trigger first. Some said it was an accident, others claimed it was fear, but the result was the same. The farmer fell dead on the ground. The village erupted. Women screamed, children cried, and the men rushed forward in rage. Rocks were thrown, tools were raised, and the soldiers, panicked and surrounded, fired their weapons to defend themselves. In moments, the quiet village turned into a battlefield. Houses caught fire from stray blasts, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. When reinforcements arrived, the humans secured the area with overwhelming force, leaving the village in ashes. What had begun as a simple patrol ended as a massacre. News of the tragedy spread quickly across the alien world. Stories of the dead farmer and the burning village traveled from mouth to mouth, carrying with them anger and grief. Many who had once waited patiently for the humans to bring aid now rose in fury. To them, this was proof that humanity was not there to save them but to dominate them. Protests began in cities where crowds demanded that the humans leave. But the humans, seeing large gatherings as a threat, broke up the protests with force. The more they tried to control the population, the more resistance they created. Mistrust turned into rebellion. Alien fighters who had once laid down their arms in the hope of peace now picked them up again. This time not against their old rivals, but against the humans. Villages became strongholds, cities became battlegrounds, and the cries that had once been for food and medicine were now cries for freedom. The humans responded with the only way they knew, with strength. They launched operations to pacify the rebels, sending troops into alien streets and dropping fire from the skies on suspected hideouts. But war is never neat, and innocent families were caught in the middle. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, flames lighting up the night sky, smoke covering the stars the aliens once prayed to. To the aliens, it was no longer possible to deny the truth. Their mistake had become clear. They had asked for help, and instead they had called down the most dangerous force in the galaxy. Humanity's power was undeniable. Their weapons, their ships, their discipline, all of it made them unstoppable. But that power was not saving lives. It was destroying them. What was meant to be protection had twisted into domination. Even among the humans, doubts began to grow. Young soldiers who had joined the fleet believing they would be rescuers now found themselves burning villages and fighting children with stones in their hands. Some whispered in private that this was wrong, that humanity had lost its way, but their orders were clear and disobedience meant punishment. So they marched on, their hearts heavy, their faces grim, carrying out actions that many would regret for the rest of their lives. The aliens, however, had no such choice. They fought because they had to, because to surrender meant losing everything: their homes, their dignity, their very future. Families hid in the ruins, teaching their children to stay quiet when the human patrols passed. Farmers buried weapons beneath their fields, waiting for the day they would strike back. Entire generations once hopeful for peace were now raised in the shadow of fear and hatred. As the conflict spread, entire cities were torn apart. Streets that once bustled with trade now echoed with gunfire. Great monuments that told the history of the alien people crumbled under bombardment. Libraries filled with knowledge were reduced to ash. What had taken centuries to build was destroyed in days. The humans saw this destruction as necessary to establish control, but the aliens saw it as proof of betrayal. Soon, even the cries of the weak changed. When the distress signal was first sent, the aliens had begged for aid and peace. But now their voices carried a different message: pleas for survival, for freedom, for the strength to drive out the ones they had once called saviors. Mothers who had once prayed for human doctors now prayed only that their children would live another day. Elders who had once welcomed the fleets now cursed the skies they came from. In the end, the galaxy looked upon the tragedy with horror. Other civilizations who had once ignored the aliens' cries now watched as humanity's iron hand closed around them. Some whispered warnings, others condemned the humans, but most stayed silent, too afraid to stand against the new force rising among the stars. For the aliens, the truth could not be undone. Their fatal mistake had been made the moment they sent their message to Earth. What they thought would bring salvation had instead brought ruin. Humanity's arrival had not healed their wounds, it had deepened them. The help they had begged for became the nightmare they could not escape. And their cries, once filled with hope, were now filled only with the desperate will to survive. Years passed after the war between humans and the alien world ended, but the scars never healed. The land still bore the marks of fire and ruin. Blackened ruins of villages stood as silent reminders of the day when hope had turned to terror. Entire cities had been torn apart, and even though some were rebuilt, they never returned to their former beauty. Families that once dreamed of healing now carried the memories of loss. Children who had survived grew up with stories whispered by their parents of the day humanity came, not with doctors, but with soldiers. It became a bitter saying that spread across the planet, repeated in hushed voices whenever someone remembered the first signal they had sent. We asked for doctors, and they sent soldiers. These words were carved into stone memorials, written on the walls of ruined homes, and taught to the young as both a lesson and a warning. For the aliens, it was not just a phrase. It was the summary of their greatest mistake and their deepest wound. It was the truth of how trust had turned into ashes. Survivors gathered in small groups and told their stories to one another. Old men recalled how they had once looked to the skies with hope, believing that the sight of human ships meant salvation. Old women remembered how they had prepared food and gifts for the human visitors, only to see their homes burned when soldiers arrived instead of healers. Children, now grown, spoke of how they had watched their parents die in wars that should never have happened. Each story added another layer of pain to the bitter memory, and each retelling kept alive the lesson. Never again trust so blindly. The phrase spread beyond their world. Traders, refugees, and wanderers carried the story across the stars. They told of how one civilization, desperate and broken, had called for mercy and received war instead. Other races listened, some with shock, others with quiet understanding. Soon the story became a warning known throughout the galaxy. Leaders repeated it in council chambers. Teachers spoke it in classrooms. Be careful who you call for help, they said. The lesson was clear. Once the humans became involved, the outcome was never certain. They might save you, or they might destroy you. Humanity's reputation shifted because of this tragedy. Across the stars, they were no longer seen only as the fierce death worlders who could survive anything. Now they were seen as a double-edged sword. To some, they were heroes who could turn the tide of war. Defenders who never gave up. Protectors who fought with unmatched strength. To others, they were conquerors, beings whose power was too dangerous, whose presence brought as much destruction as it did salvation. Every world now had to ask itself, if humanity answered, would it bring healing or domination? Would it bring peace or endless war? Even within humanity itself, debates began to rise. Soldiers who had been part of the occupation returned home with heavy hearts, carrying memories of burning villages and terrified faces. Some spoke openly, saying that Earth had made a mistake, that they had misunderstood the plea for help and answered with fear instead of compassion. Others defended the actions, claiming they had done what was necessary to protect their own species. But no matter how the arguments went, the phrase echoed even among humans themselves. We asked for doctors, and they sent soldiers. It haunted them, a reminder that their choices had consequences far greater than they had expected. For the aliens who had sent the call, the price was unbearable. Their trust had been betrayed, their homes destroyed, their people scattered. Generations later, the young still grew up with the memory of that betrayal etched into their culture. They sang songs of sorrow, carved symbols of loss into their temples, and swore oaths that such a mistake would never be made again. They had asked for kindness and received conquest. They had placed their future in the hands of strangers and watched it burn away. Across the galaxy, civilizations remembered the event not just as a tragedy, but as a turning point. It was a reminder that help was never simple, that power came with a cost. Some worlds grew more cautious, refusing to ever send out distress calls, fearing that humanity might be the ones to answer. Others prepared themselves in advance, building defenses and ensuring that if humans did come, they would not be left helpless. In this way, the legacy of the tragedy shaped the galaxy itself, creating a shadow of caution wherever the story was told. And yet, the story also revealed the strange truth of humanity. They were capable of both mercy and destruction, compassion and fear. In some corners of the galaxy, humans were still celebrated as allies and protectors. In others, they were cursed as destroyers, But for the alien civilization that had sent that fateful message, the judgment was clear. To them, humanity would forever be remembered not as saviors, but as the force that turned their cries for help into cries for survival. Generations later, when children asked their elders why their cities still bore the marks of war, the elders would sit quietly for a moment before answering. They would tell the story of the signal sent into the stars, the plea for doctors, and the arrival of ships filled with soldiers. They would repeat the phrase that had defined their history, ensuring it would never be forgotten. We asked for doctors, and they sent soldiers. Those words became the soul of their memory. A scar passed down through time, a reminder of trust turned to ashes, and so, the lesson lived on, carried across the stars, written not just in books but in the hearts of all who heard it. Humanity had shown its brilliance and its resilience, but also its danger. They were a people who could save worlds, but only if they chose compassion over fear. For the aliens who had once placed their hope in them, the price of that mistake was eternal, carved into the ruins of their cities, whispered in the silence of their prayers, and remembered in every bitter word of their warning. The galaxy would never forget, and neither would they.